I just want to welcome everybody to tonight's 11th and final conversation in this series. I'm Sarah Wilson. I'm the Program Director for ISCAST, and I'd also like to introduce my partners in this endeavour, Chris Mulheron, who's the Executive Director for ISCAST. You can wave, Chris, if you want. And Nicola Hoggard-Cregan, who's the co-director of New Zealand Christians in Science, and who'll be mediating the discussion tonight. So before we begin tonight, we'd like to say thank you to everyone who has supported the conversations over the past 11 weeks. And we can tell you that we'll be organising something similar after a bit of a winter break. But in the meantime, we're going to be sending out a questionnaire on the conversations, and we encourage you to spend a few minutes filling it in. You can do it anonymously too. We'd like that feedback so we can be a bit clearer about what you think works, what doesn't, the kinds of topics you'd like discussed, where the talks should be pitched at, and just the general format of the evenings. And I just finally, on behalf of ISCAST and New Zealand Christians in Science, I want to thank all the presenters we've had for their brilliant talks and finding time in their busy schedules to contribute in this really important and meaningful way. So I will ask Nicola now if she would take over, and I guess ask someone to pray for us before we begin.
Thank you, Sarah, and a big thank you from me also, and from New Zealand Christians in Science for the last 11 weeks. It's been great and wonderful to have this cooperation with ISCAST. So tonight we have our last speaker, much anticipated, Zachary Ardern, Dr. Zachary Ardern, who is joining us from Germany, but he comes from New Zealand, and he was involved in the setup of NZCIS before he went off to Germany to do a postdoc. He has undergrad degrees in biology and philosophy and a PhD from Auckland in evolutionary biology. He uses microbial genome and gene expression data to answer fundamental evolutionary questions and to further understanding of microbial genomes. He has been a junior group leader at the chair of Microbial Ecology at the Technical University of Munich. At the moment, he's somewhere near the French border, but he's waiting to go to Cambridge in August. He's also a reviewing editor for the New Cambridge University Press open access journal, Experimental Results. Today, he will talk on the topic of whether we can infer purpose in evolution. This is a topic of immense importance and one I find personally fascinating. Zach is going to look at is logically possible, and but also whether it might be possible to find justification for this idea from within science as well. So a very big welcome to Zach. And before we start, I'm just going to ask Emma Belcher if you would just say a prayer for us. Thank you.
Sure. All right, let's pray. Lord, as we reflect on the last several weeks, we're so grateful for the rich conversations we've had that have just really brought up such a sense of wonder for your creation. I think especially reflecting on the current times of uncertainty and the unknown that we're in. It's been a really nice reminder that you are Lord of all, that you're not outside of the mystery, but you hold all creation in your hands. So we're really grateful that we get to see a glimpse of your goodness through the discussions that we've been having. And so tonight we pray for Zach. We pray for just a clarity and an ease for him as he speaks to us on the purpose and evolution. And we also pray for just a really rich conversation that just keeps leading us to your goodness and your truth. Thanks.
Thank you. Zach, over to you.
Great. Well, it's great to see some familiar faces in the audience, and it's a real privilege to speak to you all. Some of you have been important for me as I was an undergrad, something like 10 years ago. And thinking through these things, I remember emailing Nicola and others in the audience about some of these questions. So it's nice to be able to present some thoughts on it 10 years later. the question today is, can we infer purpose in evolution? Hopefully what I say is provocative and presents a new way of thinking about some of these things. This illustration is of the development of a clownfish embryo. And I chose it because the concept of development and the concept of evolution have historically been closely linked. And the term for, in some languages at least in German, the term for evolution development is the same, or historically was the same. And I think it's obvious that this process is a purposeful process. I think anyone who considers development can see that it has an end goal and it is, is purposeful, is going down a purposeful pathway. And if this is the case, then maybe the same is true for evolution as well. And that's what we'll be exploring today. Just two parts to the talk. The first is background and the second is the argument. And the way that I want to frame it is there's a very old discussion between chance and design. And I think this dichotomy is still relevant today, actually, and it's a very old debate. For instance, we have Epicurus, who ascribed basically the properties of the orderliness of the universe, its intricacy, its adaptations to chance, and others in the Greek, others in ancient Greece considered that it was due to design, for instance, Anaxagoras and Socrates down here, amongst others. So people interested in this, I highly recommend this book on creationism and its critics in antiquity, showing that this ancient discussion between chance and design was very live in ancient Greece. For the most part, it was definitely dominated by those who ascribed the universe to design rather than chance. Those preferring chance were a minority school. And this old debate continues through today, and I'll give some examples of it a little bit later. But two other points I want to hold in conversation is molecular evolution and this topic of chance and design. Okay, so molecular evolution, of course, is now of wide interest. You hear stories about it in the news, thanks to SARS-CoV-2. This is an illustration from one of the papers I worked on last year to do with the SARS-CoV-2 genome. This is the latter end of the genome with the accessory proteins. And the point is just here that we understand evolution in extreme molecular detail now. We know the genome, we know the proteins, we know what happens when we change the genome, what happens to the proteins. So there's been unprecedented effort in understanding the molecular evolution of this virus. And a lot of people have picked up something about molecular evolution along the way, thanks to the news coverage. So I want to put these two things in conversation, this ancient discussion of chance and design and modern findings about molecular evolution. So the question is, what new insights can we get about this chance and design debate when considering the new scientific findings about evolution, particularly molecular evolution? And I think there is a middle path between evolution and design, which I hope is controversial and provocative, and I hope it's fruitful as well. And these two pictures just show for me the prime examples of chance and design. So chance, the roll of the dice, and design, the intentional choice of a small target area, as I'll explain soon. And I think molecular evolution allows for a middle way between chance and design in the context of evolution. Here are two quotes giving opposite views on these things. So Jacques Monod in 1970 said that chance alone is at the source of all novelty or creation in the biosphere. And basically he'll be arguing against this view. And the other view, an ancient view held by Socrates amongst others, he asked, with such signs of forethought in these arrangements, he's talking about various biological features, can you doubt whether they're the works of chance or design? His point there is that it's obviously design in his mind. And I think this dichotomy is not actually being changed by the findings in molecular evolution, but we'll see why soon. And one reason is we just zoom out and look at the really big picture of the universe. We start with hydrogen soup, a soup of protons, and somewhere along the way we ended up with the human brain. I think when we just think about just this trajectory, it looks, I would say, similarly purposeful to the original trajectory of the clownfish embryo. This, to me at least, has the appearance of purpose. And so I would say the unfolding of complexity in the universe is an extremely impressive narrative. These are the approximate timescales. The first part took approximately 10 billion years before we had DNA, and from there we relatively quickly, it's not sure how quickly, but it was very quickly, got prokaryotic cells, eukaryotic cells, animals, and eventually the human brain, amongst, of course, many other outcomes as well. So can we see purpose from this? And if so, is this just a subjective add-on? And are we actually obliged to give the credit for this process to chance alone, or are we not? The focus of my research is this kind of area, particularly the prokaryotic side. But I've considered things from the genetic code through to evolution in eukaryotic cells as well. Quick reminder or revision: what is evolution by natural selection? What do I mean by that? So this is just a simple illustration. Imagine we have a collection of cells, maybe in a petri dish of some kind. These might be bacterial cells. This is the starting point. Evolution by natural selection has just two simple elements. Mutation first. So some of the cells are changed in some way at the genetic level. So this might be by gene duplication. It might be a single nucleotide change. It might be an insertion or deletion, or a structural change like an inversion or a chromosome duplication, or various other complex kinds of mutations. So any of these things might happen. And on the standard view, this is by chance, and we'll discuss this a little bit. And then the next step is natural selection, that some of these have a selective advantage, a growth advantage in the particular environment in which the cells are found. And this is an example of, this is just a basic illustration of evolution by natural selection. So this is what I mean. The two core elements, of course, are mutation and natural selection. Is this just theoretical, or can we actually observe it? And it turns out we can observe it. And this is the nicest illustration I know, which hopefully some of you have seen, which is from a 2016 experiment. I'll just let it run a few times and explain it. So this is a large petri dish. This is, I think, maybe 3 meters long. And the black areas indicate places where bacteria are currently not growing. White areas are places where bacteria are growing. And at the start of this, there's only bacteria on the edges. And the reason they're not growing in the middle is because there's antibiotic chemicals present. So the bacteria initially are not able to grow, but if they change genetically, they're able to, potentially, they might be able to grow. And if they would, that would be an example of evolution, of adaptation to the antibiotic ingredients in the mixture in the middle. And there's increasing concentration of antibiotics towards the middle. So if you want to grow in the next, you see this kind of panels here. If you want to grow in the next panel, the bacteria are going to need to evolve in order to do this. So there's some nice videos of this, and this is a sped up version of what took, I think, 2 or 3 days, maybe a few days of evolution, and just sped up into a couple of seconds, showing that very rapidly the bacteria were able to grow, that they were able to evolve to the next level of antibiotic resistance. So yes, we can observe evolution in action, and we can even go back and trace the history of these things. We can say, okay, let's go to the middle and pick out one of the bacteria and see how did it change genetically from the original starting point. So this is a brilliant example of evolution, and we can probe it at the molecular level as well. Okay, so now start to think about how can we hold these things in together? How can we hold purpose and evolution together? And of course, a couple of big questions. Isn't Darwinian evolution random? And wasn't natural selection explicitly set up to be a designer substitute? And these are sensible questions. And my suggestion is that evolution and purpose can be operating at different causal levels. What do I mean by that? So yes, I would say actually yes, that both of these are true. The second one I'm not so sure about, but I think is also true. But even these things being true doesn't necessarily mean that we can't hold evolution and purpose together. So firstly, random in a scientific sense, that doesn't mean that God doesn't know the outcome. An example of this is in Proverbs 16:33. The lot, or the dice, you can imagine, is cast into the lap, but it's every decision is from the Lord. So if God is in some way outside the process, outside the natural processes, or observing the natural processes, then what appears chance in a scientific sense is not necessarily unknown to God. It's not necessarily chance to God. And the details of this idea that it's possible for something to be chance scientifically and still be purposeful are defended by a range of people: the agnostic philosopher of biology, Elliot Sober, philosopher of religion, Alvin Plantinga, and the Dutch philosopher of science, René van Wildenberg. And they explain in detail how we can hold these things together, that even if mutations are random, it doesn't mean that they're unguided or unpurposed by God. And my second point is just that whether natural selection really does get rid of design or purpose is up for debate, and that's what I'll be challenging today. So that's the first thing, that there are potentially there's different causal levels, but a slightly different concept is the idea of different explanatory levels. So it might be that two things have multiple compatible causes, but that we can't know that. For instance, we can't explain a process in terms of these different causes, or we don't have reason to explain it. So the concept of what can we reasonably infer as an explanation is a slightly different concept to what is present as a cause. But we also recognize there are different explanations. So a famous example is what caused the death of Socrates. So there's a chemical explanation you can give, that the chemical in hemlock has a particular structure and it interacted with a particular receptor and it did that. So that's a physiological or a chemical explanation. But there's also different levels of explanation, like social or psychological or moral, that he chose a particular course of action for social or moral reasons. So we recognize this in our everyday lives, that there can be different levels of explanation, and both of these explanations are legitimate and valid to point out. My point here is that maybe the same thing could be true with evolution. At least this is an option we need to keep in mind, that there could be both a scientific, mechanistic explanation and some other kind of explanation. And this point, or even a slightly stronger point, was recognized by a contemporary of Charles Darwin, Asa Gray. And he argued that the findings of evolution leave the question of design just where it was before. This is before Darwin. The issue between the skeptic and the theist is only the old one, long ago argued out, namely whether organic nature is a result of design or of chance. And this is the same point that I want to make. I think Asa Gray was completely right, that the philosophical issue of chance or design is not solved by the discoveries to do with evolution, even as we've discovered a lot more in the last 160 years since Asa Gray said this. And he has various interesting arguments, actually, and he doesn't just have this quote, he actually explains why he thinks it's legitimate to still infer design and evolution, but I'll be updating his arguments with more recent findings. So the second part is, how do we do this inference of purpose? And in general, I think a simple way to infer design is if something is rare and special. So I think in general, we can infer design if an observed outcome is very rare amongst the total possibilities and is plausibly a target an agent would be interested in. So a nice example is the dartboard. Even if this dartboard is lying on the floor, if the dart's in the middle of the board, it's reasonable for me to think that no one put it there. It's reasonable to think that someone did choose the dart to be in the middle of the board and it wasn't just chance. And this is because we know that gravity in this situation has no particular, or the laws of nature have no particular bias towards a particular point of the dartboard. So we expect if the dart's in the middle of the board, someone chose it. People in New Zealand may recognize where this is from. This is from One Tree Hill in Auckland. And if we see an interesting arrangement of rocks on the hillside, we could think, oh, that's just a result of chance, or we could infer design. If we infer design, I think it's because implicitly the number of arrangements of rocks that look like something that we find interesting is very small, compared to the total number of possibilities. Of course, this is a very controversial, people have made all kinds of controversial inferences from this, and we'll be discussing these, but I think the basic idea of this is how we infer design, I think is correct. Of course, in real world situations, the debates become about what are the proper notions of possibility space, and what do we mean by the target region, how do we define these things? I think that's where basically all the interesting debates around this kind of inference turn out to be. I think also, just as a side note, that it's going to be useful for making design inference if we already know something about the agent involved. This is an advantage that something like Christianity has over deism when it comes to natural theology. And one reason why I think natural theology supports Christianity more than it does deism, that might be controversial as well, but happy to discuss. Of course, a famous popular example of this is given in fine-tuning and cosmology, and Luke Barnes is present today, of course, so everyone should read his book and ask him questions about this. He has various papers about this as well. And this is just a well-known example, which you're probably all familiar with. And the point I want to raise today is I think there are some relevant similarities to evolution. So a couple of similarities. First is that cosmology is an historical science like evolution is. So if we can find fine-tuning in cosmology that at least raises the possibilities, we might also find fine-tuning in evolution. And secondly, I would say there are what I would call parameters and initial conditions in evolution. I also raise this because I'm going to use a similar structure for my thinking. So if you don't like fine-tuning arguments already for theological or philosophical reasons, you'll probably also disagree with my talk. But I'm okay with that because fine-tuning arguments are quite popular. Okay, so how can we do this in evolution? And I'll just very briefly explain 4 different areas where I think you could make this kind of inference. I'll just go through a couple of examples of each of these, 1 or 2 examples. The fitness of the environment, the way the environment is structured to allow evolution, the initial conditions of life seem improbable on naturalism. The parameters of evolution, I think, are less probable on naturalism than theism, and particularly evolutionary events. I want to note that these are 4 independent areas. So if one of them is successful and the others are not, I'm actually happy with that. So they needn't all be successful for my general point to come across. So maybe just pick your favorite one if you don't like all of them. And this will be an overly quick introduction to each of these topics. Each one of these deserves to be explored in depth, to have its own books written about them. Another point which people may be interested in is that contingency and law, I think, may not actually matter in this discussion. And this hopefully will also be controversial. But a lot of people in these discussions around purpose, they put a lot of weight on the findings of people like Simon Conway Morris, the idea that evolution is particularly law-like. And so this is a massive debate within biology and within the philosophy of biology. And it asks, is evolution historically contingent, as people like Stephen Jay Gould suggested, or is it more law-like, either through natural selection, as Richard Dawkins says, or perhaps some of the deeper laws of form and morphology, like Simon Conway Morris seems to prefer. And a lot of people put a lot of philosophical weight on this discussion. And I think maybe it doesn't really matter, because I would say at a deeper level, evolution is contingent. It's contingent either at the obvious level of historically contingent processes, or it's contingent at the level of the laws and the framework for natural selection. Because for God, both of those are contingent possibilities. If God had the choice between different sets of laws, then if we ascribe something in evolution to laws or to natural selection, we're actually ascribing it to a deeper choice that was possible in some metaphysical sense of possible. So there are alternative worlds, alternative possible worlds that have different laws of nature. And that means that the laws of nature we have are contingent. They could have been different. And that means, I think, for the kind of argument I'm running, it actually doesn't matter whether we think that evolution is highly law-like or highly contingent. Either way, we could run different kinds of design arguments, is what I think. Because regardless of whether it's law-like or contingent, the actual evolutionary pathways are a tiny proportion of the total possibility space. So the actual pathway is just illustrated in an example here. The grid represents all the possibilities. You can imagine it's a near infinite grid, just a huge trillions and trillions and trillions of possibilities. The actual pathway that evolution took was just a tiny proportion of that. And whether that was guided by laws or completely contingent, either way, it's a small proportion. The interesting question for design arguments is this pathway that it took, is it the kind of pathway that God would likely be interested in? If the answer is yes, then I think you can run a design argument, regardless of the question of law-likeness or historical contingency. Okay, so now I'll quickly go through these four different areas. The first one was the fitness of the environment. And this was explored in remarkable depth back in 1913 by the Harvard professor Lawrence Henderson. And he points out that there's, because Darwinians tend to talk about fitness a lot, but he points out that this concept of fitness is comprised of a mutual relationship between the organism and the environment. And of this, the fitness of the environment is as much essential as the fitness of the organism. So the environment needs to be set up in a particular way in order to get evolution to happen at all, is his basic point. And he makes the very bold claim that in fundamental characteristics, the actual environment is the fittest possible abode of life. Now, of course, I think this is a very strong claim. I think a weaker claim will be fine as well, in order to provide material for some kind of design argument. The world needn't be the best of all possible worlds to still count as evidence of design. It just needs to be better than you would expect on naturalism, roughly. And Lawrence Henderson wasn't actually making a design argument from this. He wasn't even a theist. He just, he kind of developed his own philosophy based on these things. He was just intrigued by what he saw as the remarkable fitness of the basics of biochemistry. And this has been developed in depth by Michael Denton, and I won't go into it further. I'll just give one example, which I find really striking, which was developed more by George Wald in 1959. So he's a Nobel laureate in biochemistry and also not a theist. But he explores what's the relationship between life on Earth and light. And he realizes that there's some physical limitations on what life can do with light. This is not just a matter of evolution evolving to use light. Instead, the properties of light and the way they chemically interact with matter is given to evolution, and evolution has to work with what it's given with. And it turns out evolution is given a highly restricted properties of light and its interaction with matter. So for instance, there's a lower bound on, well, there were both lower and upper bounds on the wavelength of light that's going to be appropriate to interact with matter. This is important because light is used for photosynthesis and it's used for vision, which are both hugely important for evolution, for ecology. So the amount of energy required to break a covalent bond is roughly in this, corresponds to this wavelength of light, 320 to 700 nanometers. And the amount of energy for a valence electron excitation, which is another route that could be taken for photochemistry, is in the same region, mostly in the same region of 300 to 700 nanometers. The energy upper limit, where wavelengths with light with shorter wavelengths than this will tend to be destructive for molecules, gives you the lower limit of the wavelength of around 300 nanometers. So these are the physical bounds. This is just the playing field that life has to work with. And this is interesting for a few reasons. Firstly, this is a tiny proportion of the total electromagnetic spectrum. So this is already maybe starting to look like, okay, this is the kind of thing we could think about in terms of fine tuning, because the total spectrum is vast, but the amount that's useful for life in terms of photochemistry is a tiny proportion. This is a log scale diagram. And this is just an example of how it's used in photosynthesis. That's not so interesting, but it becomes really interesting when we realize what life is actually given by stars. So most stars are producing light in roughly this kind of wavelength, the same kind of order of magnitude of wavelength that is going to be useful for photochemistry. The kind of star that we have is here illustrated as a white star, and it peaks in pretty much exactly the right region that is going to be useful for life based on the physical prerequisites. This is not, again, just a matter of life evolved to use this, but this is what physical chemistry allows life to use. So smaller wavelengths would be too destructive for molecules, and higher wavelength would be too low energy for photochemistry. So that's interesting, that the kind of light that life needs is exactly the kind of light that's produced by stars. That's one aspect, and our star is right exactly where we would want it. The other interesting aspect is the atmosphere also filters out some of the remaining harmful parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. So only a very small part of the electromagnetic spectrum actually gets through the atmosphere as well. So there's a couple of different kind of cosmic coincidences here that allow for life to use light. The light that's produced by stars is in just the right range, and the light that gets through the atmosphere is also in just the right range. This is just one of the examples of the fitness of the environment for life. It seems that life is, in this universe, is just set up to be able to use photochemistry, which is useful for photosynthesis and for vision. And the conclusion that George Wald makes, and he's also not a theist, he thinks about this topic, and he also thinks about the place of consciousness in the universe. And he comes to the conclusion that it's mind that has composed a physical universe that breeds life. So as a purely materialistic person, he says he finds this uncomfortable, but in considering just this issue of life and light and the other issue of consciousness together, that makes him think, actually, maybe mind is what's the fundamental level of reality. So he didn't come at this as an apologetic, trying to make a design argument, but he just came across this topic of the fitness of the environment and found it really striking, and came to the conclusion that actually mind is in some way involved in this. And this is discussed in the literature in astrobiology as well. There's a very recent paper here, which is one example. There's various other examples that I could go through, but I recommend Michael Denton's work on that. So that was just the first whole class of arguments, which is the fitness of the environment. And there's a range of different arguments that can be given there. But a second class of arguments is to do with the initial conditions of evolution. And we could talk there about the apparently very improbable origin of life. We could talk about what Simon Conway-Morris calls evolutionary inherency, the remarkable genetic code. So evolutionary inherency is where earlier stages of evolution set the stage for later developments. So an example of this is the molecule collagen, which I think comprises about a quarter of the proteins in our body. But it turns out that this molecule, which is crucial for animal development, was found before the origin of animals. So somehow a very similar molecule was just waiting, just ready for animal life to use later on. And from a certain perspective, at least, you can see why this kind of fits well with the idea of purpose or foresight, that the initial stages seem to be well established to allow for the later evolutionary developments. And there's lots of examples of this, and Simon Conway-Morris mentions a couple of these in his book, Life Solution, I think. Something I've researched myself is the structure of the genetic code, and this also could be talked about a lot, but there's lots of interesting features of this. So the first one is illustrated in this picture, that the way that the code is arranged actually matches the biochemical features of the amino acids. So these are illustrated here with colors. So the amino acids with the same color have similar chemical properties. And it turns out that the ones with similar chemical properties also tend to be grouped together within the table. So this is a well-known feature of the code. And it's one way in which the code is highly optimal, but there's numerous additional ways as well. And some of these we reviewed in a paper a couple of years ago. I think maybe 5 or so aspects that have been proposed to be optimal in the code. One important example is that the code seems to be optimal for evolution itself. In that the kinds of mutations that occur given the structure of the code, if you change a nucleotide, because of the structure of the code, it tends to go to a particular kind of amino acid. These kinds of changes that are facilitated by the code structure are optimized for evolution. They allow the searching of evolutionary space more efficiently than you would expect from arbitrary code structures. And this is just one example of a number of interesting features of the code that have been discussed. And there's literature there that people can explore if they like. Okay, so this was the second issue of the initial conditions of life. And we could talk a lot more about the origin of life and such, but I'm just going to have a quick biological note before I move on to the next point. The note is that just to be aware of this relationship between the genotype, the genetic sequence, here shown as amino acids, and then the phenotype. You can imagine an example of this as protein, like the spike protein in SARS-CoV-2. And then the fitness is the result for the organism's growth, population growth, as illustrated here. So the important concepts here is that there's a mapping between the genotype, all the different possible genotypes are in some way connected to all the different possible phenotypes, morphologies, for instance, protein forms. And we can start to work out some of this mapping. So what happens if we change an amino acid here? What does it do to this protein and such? So these are huge maps or terrains mapping all the different possibilities at the genotype level between all the possibilities at the phenotype level. And then we have a second map, all the possible phenotypes and how they relate to fitness, how they relate to the growth of the organism or the reproduction of the organism. So these are the concepts of the genotype-phenotype map and the phenotype-fitness map, and they can be merged together into a fitness landscape. Okay, so this is background for the second concept of convergence in evolution. And this is reasonably well known that evolution exhibits these convergences. This is just a really kind of funny or strange example. So this is a beetle at the top, and this is deer antlers at the bottom. And you see similar kind of structures emerging. The antlers or the antennae of a beetle and the antlers of a deer is kind of a striking example of what could be called convergence, but there's thousands of these examples. An example closer to my field is a really striking example of the convergent evolution of propellers in prokaryotes. So there's two different main kinds of prokaryotes, the bacteria and the archaea, and they have different kinds of flagellum. So this is now called the bacterial flagellum, which is fairly famous in science fact discussions, of course, and the archaeal flagellum, or the archaeolum. And these, it turns out, are actually evolutionarily unrelated to each other, but they're both rotary nanomachines that are remarkably similar in a few different ways. So the consensus now is that, as shown in this recent paper, the convergent evolution of archaea, flagella, and also cilia in eukaryotes, propulsive nanomachines. So these two in particular are strikingly similar, but have different evolutionary ancestors. So I'm not trying to make a design argument from the flagellum per se. I'm just, not in the usual way anyway, but instead I'm pointing out the fact that the same remarkable outcomes or similar remarkable outcomes keep on occurring in evolution. This suggests a law-likeness to evolution, or suggested tendencies in evolution, which is wildly surprising on naturalism, I would think. But the fact that we get these nanomachines, which look so much like human machines when we go into some of the details around the rotary motor, is really striking, and I think pointed to some kind of intentionality. Just an example of the similarities is that they're the flagellum, so the material that is making up the tail of these things, has a fairly similar molecular structure, even though they're actually completely unrelated evolutionarily. And there's many such examples of convergence in evolution. So these are examples of the parameters of evolution, the kind of process that evolution is, the kind of directions it tends to go. Another whole example of parameters in evolution is this issue of the phenotype map that I illustrated before, the genotype-phenotype map. And recent findings have been that there are biases in this map, which are actually really important for evolution. So historically it was assumed that natural selection is doing all the work in evolution. But it turns out this is not the case, at least, for instance, in the evolution of RNA structures. So what we're interested here is the green portion. These are the kinds of RNAs that we actually see in life, the natural RNA shapes. It turns out that these are highly biased towards the RNA shapes that are highly probable and in the total possibility space of different RNAs. They're not evenly distributed over all the possible RNA shapes. It's not that natural selection, it's not that RNA shapes are being randomly produced and natural selection is doing all the work, in which case you'd expect they're randomly distributed over the functional RNA shapes. Instead, they're biased towards the highly probable. So the structure of the genotype-phenotype map is actually doing a lot of the work in evolution. This is quite a complicated technical point, but there's a lot of literature on it if you're interested, from people like Ardern, who's a Christian biophysicist in Oxford. This is one of his papers, for instance. And there's a lot of work on the cutting edge of evolutionary theory showing that it's not natural selection that's doing all the work, but these maps, in this case, the genotype-phenotype map, which is given by the basics of biophysics, is actually doing the work, not just natural selection. This is discussed in some really nice work from Andreas Wagner as well. He has a nice book, Arrival of the Fittest. And so he points out natural selection can preserve innovations, but it can't create them. Nature's many innovations call for natural principles that accelerates life's ability to innovate. And here in a paper on randomness, he points out that the non-random organization of complex phenotypes in genotype space are essential for organic evolution. So it's this genotype-phenotype map that's doing a lot of the work in evolution, which is given to evolution. It's not produced by natural selection. Okay, the last whole area of arguments that I just very quickly point to is there are surprising events in evolution. So by analogy, there are occasionally surprising events in astronomy or geology. For instance, the formation of the moon is, I believe, thought to be an incredibly improbable event on the current models. And we also see these incredibly improbable historical events in evolution that turned out to be crucial for later development. So this is just illustrating the origin of the human brain. And numerous other examples, the origin of life that I've already mentioned, the origin of the eukaryotic cell, the origin of animals. There's numerous points in evolution which look incredibly improbable. From a naturalist perspective, they require a huge input of chance. But from a theistic perspective, we can say, well, maybe actually this is room for inferring design, for inferring intentionality or purpose. When there's a highly improbable event which gives a really interesting outcome, I think it's reasonable, at least for the theist, to infer purpose or the possibility of purpose there. Okay, so this is my conclusion. It seems reasonable to me to see signs of purpose in this whole process from hydrogen soup to the human brain in terms of these four different aspects: the fitness of the environment, the initial conditions of life, the parameters of evolution, such as the phenotype map and the fitness map, and startling evolutionary events. If you're interested in further reading, here's a couple of things. And you're welcome to email me with questions. And I look forward to the discussion now.
Thank you so much, Zach. That was a very concise summary of a very complex field. I think we have gone a little bit over time, so I think we're going to also extend a little bit beyond the time that we normally end, just to give people time to discuss. And Zach, if you don't mind staying over a little bit later when we finish as well, just in case people have some more questions. Okay. You can, perhaps if you can unshare, Zach, so we can see more people. And perhaps, okay, questions have started. Lewis Jones, do you want to unmute and give your question?
Hey Zach, this is not on the big picture. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm the first one. This is a bad start. But I was just curious about your evolution of the bacteria at the beginning. The example of seeing evolution in practice. I'm just wondering about, like, the number of generations that it took for them to get across each barrier, and the implications for the complex, more takes us a few years to reproduce every generation, etc. What are the implications for the long term, filling up the last 2 billion years on the Earth, sort of thing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't actually know the answer, but it will just be a few generations. So it's partly because there's huge population sizes there, because they have this huge petri dish, this mega plate. But it's just over the course of a few days that evolution happens. So it'll just be on the order of tens of generations, maybe up to 100 generations. But the real work is being done by the huge population sizes. So they're exploring a lot of the possible point mutations. And these, in this case, I think point mutations are enough to get to the next stage of antibiotic resistance. Implications for the bigger picture, I don't even know. I mean, it just illustrates some of the basics of evolution that a big population size will be helpful. So, something that is interesting is that humans had a very small population size historically. So to me, at least, it seems really surprising that we get the complexity of the human brain over the course of a few million years, with a very small effective population size of 10,000. To me, that looks like a surprising evolutionary event.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay.
Appreciate that.
Okay. Questions are pouring in now. Philip Pattermore, can you please give your question?
Yeah, Zach, thank you very much. It was fascinating talk. I just wonder how much of some of the earlier that little point grid with the path through it could be a retrospective view. It's a bit like history is told by the survivors or the victors kind of thing. And there could have been a whole lot of other paths that have been pruned by natural selection, for instance, and that we're looking at the end result and not the initial random array.
Yes, for sure. And this is going to be the main challenge in making any kind of design argument from these things, is we don't really know the other possible outcomes. Mm-hmm. So any design arguments in this area are not going to be highly quantitative. Mm-hmm. But for me, that's not really a problem, because most of our inferences are not highly quantitative either. So when we see the structure of rocks on the hillside that spells out someone's name, we don't quantify that. We don't say, okay, that was 10 to the minus 17 in probability. We just look at that and say, okay, that looks designed. So I think there's a good point here that the outcomes are vast. They're hyper-astronomical, and we can't really get a good sense of those. But we can just look at what we observe and consider the mechanisms as we understand them, and consider whether the mechanisms, whether it seems like a surprising result, basically. And I think given the relatively finite, 14 billion years seems a long time, but it's not that long compared to the total spaces that we're talking about. So to me, it looks very clearly like a fairly directional, purposeful process.
It's been rigged.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think Fred Hoyle said something like that. Yeah.
Okay. Graham McLean says he's got a simple question. Graham?
Thank you, Nicola. I'm just unmuting and appearing. I'm a bit embarrassed to be asked next because it's a very simple question. Zach, thank you very much indeed. I wish I could sit at your feet for a few years and understand the relevant biology, because I just don't know enough about it, but it's all very fascinating. And it seems to me very reasonable what you're saying. I take it that what this boils down to is a question about inference to the best explanation. And we have various hypotheses, and we're trying to assess the observable data, the probability of those observable data given the relevantly different probabilities. And these various phenomena you're drawing attention to are data that we would not expect on the naturalist hypothesis, but we've got good reason to expect on a theistic hypothesis. And that seems to me a thoroughly reasonable way of tackling it. And I don't understand why people get very upset about that kind of extension of ordinary reasoning to the best explanation from biology into the more metaphysical questions. There is, of course, the question what prior probabilities we're going to be attaching to our different hypotheses in the background. And that's, I think, what's doing a lot of the background work in the controversies. But I take it that's the
so I think your internet has cut, unless that's just on my side.
No, I think it is Graham's. Yeah, seems to have frozen.
Okay.
Do you want to give an answer?
Yeah, something I can just say is that I guess I'm borrowing from a lot of the work on the fine-tuning argument, and it's just a helpful analogy, a helpful area where this kind of reasoning has been developed. And I'm happy to copy and paste a lot of that into the area of theoretical biology is what I would say. Yeah.
Okay. Can I ask you a question, Zach?
Yes.
Just pop in here, because a lot of you, a lot of your examples require a sort of intuitive understanding of a lot of very complex biology, and some physics as well. Is there any way of sort of communicating this stuff to people so that they don't sort of think that you are in some ways bewitching them, you know, coming up with tricks, so to speak, you know, because there is an intuitive sort of component to all of this, that you look at the whole of this and you think it makes sense. You know?
Yeah, so I think the point of design argument is to save the design intuition, or at least that's how I kind of think about it. So there is a design intuition, and I think it's a reasonable one. And the design argument is like what's under the hood, or we can explore what's under the hood of that mechanistically in terms of the biology. And we can show, okay, I guess the dialectic as I see it is we have the design intuition, and then Darwinism says, no, I'm a defeater for the design intuition. And then we go a deeper level and say, okay, let's look under the hood of evolution. Does Darwinism work as a defeater for the design intuition? So that's the level of so I think because of that, it's going to be complicated, because the Darwinian response, when it gets into its details, is complicated. But if we're not worried about the Darwinian response, we can just start with the simple design intuition. Yeah, that's how I think about it anyway.
Yeah.
That's the way to present it. And then the details are just actually the response to the response. Maybe there's probably ways to clarify the argument as well, I'm sure. But the same is true with fine-tuning arguments and such. If someone has an objection to the fine-tuning argument, then the response is going to be complicated. But I think that's okay.
Okay. Mike, do you want to give your question?
Yes, hi, thanks for that presentation. I've struggled to understand for some time how blunt sort of selection pressures like cold and heat and drought conditions and so on can force, very minuscule changes in protein structures, for example, to make cell systems just slightly more advantageous, and how that would actually translate through to a survival advantage in an animal that would allow it to reproduce more successfully than its peers, since then all of the changes at the molecular level are so minute, but all add up to something very potent. And I was wondering whether that concept of the genotype phenotype map helped to explain, why there was bias towards, really favorable improvements, which in and of themselves are very, very minor contributions.
Yeah, there's, I think the maps are crucial, and still most mutations are deleterious. But we just need to go beyond a threshold where there's enough that are advantageous that evolution can work. I think that's just what evolution requires. There are also larger changes. So in my PhD, I saw gene duplications in yeast over a few hundred generations of yeast. And there was a gene duplication of a transporter gene. So they had a very clear, and it transported sugar into the cell. The environment was low on sugar, so it made perfect sense biologically. So there are some clear cases where you can see the adaptation is clearly connected to the change. And sometimes there are larger, like whole chromosome or whole gene changes. But for understanding the detailed pathway, then understanding the structure of the map will be really useful. Understanding the fitness landscape. And because the fitness landscape is very complicated, I think this allows for the evolution of complexity, basically, that if you wind your way through the fitness landscape, you can end up in very complex areas.
Okay. Philip Pattermore wants to differ. He wants to say that most mutations will be neutral rather than deleterious.
Yeah, maybe I misspoke on that. It kind of depends how we define. It depends on population sizes and how we define, because what's selective or neutral is very environment dependent. In viruses and bacteria, I think maybe most deleterious, but yeah, it'll depend on. That's a good point. There is a lot of neutral mutations. That's important to keep in mind.
Zach, if you don't mind people emailing you, can you just put your email in the chat?
Yes, sure.
People might have questions they want to follow up. Maybe
they can just Google me and find us as well.
They can, that's true. Okay, Jake, do you want to give your question?
Sure. Thanks, Zach. That was very, very interesting. Very interesting to see, particularly the stuff around the RNA. It was very interesting. I hadn't heard that before. So I was just wondering if you could expand on your definition of purpose as being something that's rare or special. I feel as if this is kind of a bit narrow. For example, you were talking a little bit about how repetition is seen as also, purpose, so like the convergence, and often periodic things are often seen also as something that's got some sort of, law-like nature to it. So I was just wondering what you thought about that, and also what you thought about maybe considering the increase in complexity as a metric for purpose.
Yes, I think that they're both getting at something similar. So complexity is basically improbability, or at least a lot of people, they're kind of interchangeable. In terms of, so complexity means either lots of parts or lots of interactions between parts. And this is inherently improbable, or assumed to be improbable if everything is kind of equaled out. If everything is evenly distributed, then you don't have lots of interactions, specific interactions between parts. So there's a close relationship between complexity and improbability and rareness and purpose, I think. So when I said rare or special, I was trying to get at what is the structure of a design inference or an inference to purpose. And I think those are the two conditions that you require, that it be rare, because if a pattern is not rare, then you can ascribe it to just to chance. You can ascribe it just to chance. So if I throw the Legos on the floor, most of those patterns are not interesting. Only a very small subset would I say, okay, that looks like it's been designed. So I think you need the rarity and the specialness as well. The specialness is what helps you show that it's an agent, because all patterns of Lego on the floor are equally improbable in some sense, but only some of them are special. So I think that's why you need both the rarity and the specialness. And I think complexity is another good metric, and it's related to the rarity, I would say.
Okay, we'll just have 3 more questions before we finish, and then I think perhaps Sarah or Chris would like to say something after that. Graham wants to finish his question.
Thank you, Nicola, and I'm very sorry. Internet just dropped out, and I don't know, Zach, whether you said anything in response, but what I was going on to say was the argument will need not just that the data you're appealing to would be improbable on the naturalistic hypothesis, but obviously more probable, perhaps very probable, on the theistic hypothesis. And somebody might say on that last point, has that condition really been met? Why would we expect God to be interested in all this messy long-term evolutionary stuff at all? Sure, if he's going to be bothered with evolution, you'd expect purposeful outcomes at the end, but why be bothered with evolution at all? Why not just do what the creationists think Genesis 1 and 2 is telling us happens? And so why should we expect any of this on the God hypothesis?
Yeah,
I'm not advocating that. I'm interested in your answer.
Sure. So that's there's a similar answer to fine-tuning arguments as well. Fine-tuning could have been, the universe could have been more fine-tuned. That's a common response to fine-tuning arguments. And the proper counter-response is, well, it doesn't matter. The problem is with naturalism. The problem is that this is more likely on theism than naturalism. So maybe creationism would be more probable on, let's say that. It doesn't matter for the structure of the argument, because we're just comparing, so long as there's some bias in the probability distribution towards this outcome given theism, then that's all we need. And I think there is, because the outcomes are so special. The complexity of the human brain, human language, human relationships, and culture and such. I think that's just obviously theism leaning as an outcome. Yeah, but that's one side of the argument that needs to be specified more, is why is this evolutionary origin of humans or whatever still evidence for theism? But I think it is because the outcome's so special. And it doesn't matter if some other outcome was more likely given theism, that actually doesn't matter by itself, so long as this is more probable than the naturalistic alternative.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm trying to speed things along in a very complex field, I know, but perhaps Antonius very briefly, and then Luke Barnes very briefly before the end. Antonius.
Yeah, thanks, Zach. That was really interesting. I'm just wondering if you could clarify for me whether your model is a model where God just twiddles the dials at the beginning of the universe and then leaves everything to run naturally, or whether your model involves tinkering to explain those very improbable things along the way.
Both are possible, is my short answer. And I don't think my model specifies either way. You know, I'm actually happy with both, because I would say that God letting the universe run naturally is God sustaining the universe by the word of his power. And there is no such thing as natural sustaining of the universe. The universe is not autonomous, I would say. So that's why I'm not too worried about whether it's like a front-loading initial setup, or whether it's also, I'm fully open to interventionism, but the structure of the argument is just that these outcomes are interesting, and even given the strictest materialistic account of them that you can give, we're still left with this problem of purpose. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Luke Barnes, last question.
Hi, Zach. Thanks for the plug. I'm thinking about randomness, and so there are people like Alex Rosenberg, who, when they talk about randomness in science, they mean, you know, so random even God couldn't know what happens next. And then you have Richard Dawkins saying all he means by randomness is just like uncorrelated with success. So a mutation is random if it doesn't systematically. So,
yeah.
But those are two very different ideas. I'm wondering, what does evolution actually need? What idea of randomness, what idea of randomness do I actually need to inject into the theory to make it work?
It doesn't need either, actually. So this is evolution per se doesn't require any concept around the distribution of mutations. But Darwinian evolution specifies that these are random with regard to their outcome, because it wants the work to be done by natural selection. So in evolutionary theory today, it's actually controversial. Are the mutations random? But so I just went with the strictest Darwinian picture, which is actually kind of giving, maybe giving away more than I need to. But let's say the strictest Darwinian picture is true, then the mutations are random in the sense that they're not biased towards advantage in the current environment. So definitely not the Rosenberg interpretation. That's just a metaphysical gloss. That's possible, but it's not required by evolution. The strictest, so this is what Elliot Sober defends. He has some nice essays, and he's good because he's one of the leading philosophers of biology. He's not a theist, but he defends the idea that the kind of randomness that evolution is talking about is just orthogonal to the question of whether the mutations are purposed. And so Alvin Plantinga picks up on Elliot Sober's definition. So it's just the mutations are not biased towards adaptation in the current environment. And that's actually, that some aspects of that are actually controversial empirically. Yep.
Okay, well, I think we should finish here, although Zachary will stay on after we finish for a little while if anyone wants to ask a few more questions. So thank you so much, Zachary, that you've given us a sort of tantalizing glimpse of a very complex field. And obviously we could go on for hours and come back again next week. But in the meantime, I think either Chris or Sarah is going to say a few things before Jake sends us all off with a prayer. So, Chris. Or
Nicola, yeah. On behalf of ISCAST, we just want to say thank you again to everybody, all the presenters and all those people who have joined us. We got up to 70-something people tonight, I think, and we will do this again. We'll also be sending you a short questionnaire for feedback. Please do fill that in, give us a few clues for next time. We'd really appreciate that. So I think it's over to you, Jake. Are you there, Jake?
He was there a minute ago.
Are you unmuted, Jake? There he is. His face is here, but thanks, Jake.
The internet just died as I was about to pray. But I am back, thanks to the cellular network.
Wonderful.
Great. All right, well, shall we pray? God, we thank you so much for this opportunity to explore your incredible creation. We thank you for our brother Zachary, for his insights into your amazing creation. We thank you that as we explore this at a deeper level, we find you working in such incredible ways. We thank you for the way that you have created and designed such an incredible environment and creatures that can love and serve you. And Lord, we pray that we can direct all of our praise and worship towards you. So we thank you, and we pray this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, Jake. And I should say what a pleasure it's been having our New Zealand friends with us for this series.
And it's been a pleasure having all of the Australians. So thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you from NZCIS.
Well, people are welcome to keep chatting for a few minutes, but we have formally finished. But Jack's agreed to stay around for a little bit, so feel free to ask another question or offer your comments.
Jake, I'd just like to ask your views on the differences or similarities between purpose and determinism.
Purpose and determinism. Sorry?
But the difference or similarities between the purpose you've talked about
right, yeah.
and determinism, more a theological term.
The theological determinism?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Right, so if you, so I guess this kind of picture would require, if you think God foreknew the outcome, and this will require a strong view of God's foreknowledge, I guess. So it kind of depends. Yeah, so it's going to depend on your concept of God's foreknowledge. as to whether you think whether you think the front loading, at least option, is feasible. Like for instance, if you think that creation has some kind of real freedom, some kind of, I would say, extreme freedom, such that God doesn't know the processes of mutations in advance, then you couldn't really, or you could only have a very vague, maybe the structure of the genotype-phenotype map would give you some kind of vague probabilities of what is likely to happen, but it wouldn't give you any confidence in it. So yeah, it really depends which argument you're going with, because I guess I gave 4 different ones that people could rely on, and people with different views about God's foreknowledge might prefer one or the other. Because I have a strong view of God's sovereignty, I guess I'd say that all of them are fine with me, that it doesn't matter to me whether God operates through chance processes or such, but other people might have different views on that. That was kind of that wasn't a very satisfying answer, but so I think, I mean, the main point I want to make, I guess, is that I think a lot of people put too much emphasis on things like the Simon Conway Morris view, which I think is really helpful. It's really interesting that evolution could be law-like, but I think it doesn't need to be law-like for God to still be involved. If you have a reasonably high view of God's foreknowledge or sovereignty, then it doesn't matter whether the evolutionary process could be wholly historically contingent, like Stephen Jay Gould thought, and that's fine with me.
I guess the corollary to that is that is God giving us more freedom or free will or free choice if we let things run a little bit more than if it's too purpose orientated. I was at a very interesting presentation earlier on today by a guy called Mark Sagar, who some of you may know is the brains behind most of the animation and TV movies, right back from, well, since it began really. He's a New Zealander, graduate of the Auckland University, like you are. And he and his fellows are now creating, shall we say, on the screen, on an IT screen, artificial life that responds to the questions of the questioner in such a way as that there's more than just a set of axioms they're answering, but there's actually an interplay in terms of emotions and things like that, and really pointing towards intelligent design, well, actually pointing towards the horror of horrors, robots that actually can be human and interact with us. The question I was left with when listening to this, though, is that there's something that's always going to be missing in such a being, and that is the hand of God, or the presence of God, or the spirit of God, or whatever Christians want to call the soul. So I guess that's really what I'm asking you about, is that you get these 2 points together, we can make them touch, but should we be doing that?
Yeah, so some people want to draw the analogy to free will and the evolutionary process and say evolution is free, and I guess I just don't want to do that. So I don't see room for doing that really. But that's because I have a high view of God's sovereignty and foreknowledge. People who are more on the kind of open theist side, I guess, might be more open to evolution also being free. But human free will only kicks in really late in the process, so it's not affecting the big picture. Maybe some animal choices are. This is kind of, I guess, something that some people discuss, is there a role for animal choices or freedom in some sense in evolution? But for me, it doesn't really matter, because I think God still foreknows those outcomes.
Say that again. God still what?
Foreknows, knows in advance the outcomes of any free choices. But people will differ on that theologically. That's okay.
Matthew Mateague, do you still want to give your question?
Hello.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. I had my microphone on mute. Yeah. Hi, Zach. I had a quick question. It's just kind of in relation to what you just presented and the kind of research I pursue in my PhD. My opinion on the whole creationist evolutionist dialectic is that it's something that 21st century discourse should try and surpass, because in my opinion, that Darwinism imbibes a lot of the 18th century metaphysics of his time, and that just doesn't do justice to the 21st century sciences we have: dynamical systems theory, complexity theory, phenomenology, and et cetera, et cetera. So I was just wondering what would be your opinion on maybe just reconceiving evolution in a 21st century guise to free it from Darwinism per se and sort of the 18th century metaphysics that the commentators like Dawkins seem to think necessitates situating evolution in.
Yeah, that's a good question. And so some people are doing this with like the third way of evolution. So there are an extended evolutionary synthesis and such. So there's some discussions around this, but I guess I haven't thought about there's all things that might be meant by the metaphysics of evolution. So yes, like
very, very open question I asked. I understand that. Yeah.
But I think, basically, I've just been really impressed with what Asa Gray said. It just struck me just how things that I had been thinking already, he had already said back in 1860, and that the basic issue is a philosophical one. And I think for naturalists, they have to rely on chance ultimately.
Yeah.
At some deep level, naturalism has to be about chance and the infinitude of possibilities. Something like a multiverse is what naturalists have always appealed to get around the design issue.
Yeah.
So it's definitely an open scientific question of what evolution is going to look like in future. And I'm not too worried about whether it's Darwinian or not. So a lot of Christians have put weight on non-Darwinian things, which I think are interesting, but I don't think that's required in any sense, because the ultimate philosophical question of chance and design is still with us, even on the strictest Darwinian view. I think, yeah, but there's lots of interesting stuff. The third way of evolution, extended evolutionary synthesis.
Yeah, well, actually, coincidentally enough, that's kind of the field I work within, and it kind of sits on the nexus of that and contemporary theories of cognition. And hopefully, I'll give a talk on that topic and its relation to Christian theology sometime down the track, and I prepare a talk on that. Yeah, so it's just my opinion that you can't have an adequate theory of evolution unless you find a way to naturalize purpose and meaning. And once you naturalize purpose and meaning, then naturalism is going to look like a very different beast entirely. Right. Very, very different to the kind of secular pop atheist narratives we have in vogue now from Dawkins and co. And yeah, that's my perspective on the topic, really. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's discussions around teleonomy.
Yeah.
But I just don't know much about that.
Okay. Yeah.
But there are discussions on trying to naturalize these concepts in some way, and broader concepts of naturalism and such.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. I think Graham would like another question.
Thank you, Nicola. That's very kind of you. Zachary, I did say if we run out of other questions, I just want to say again, if I may, how terrific I think this has been, and how much I personally, and I'm sure I speak for many others, would want to encourage you in your work which is doing expert science and using hard-headed reasoning to follow where it would go. And that's what I think is terrifically valuable. I'm interested, though, to know how much opposition you and others come across as a distant observer, not in science. I'm intrigued to see how hostile many people are even to the discussion of these sorts of things, as if this is so contrary to good science that these hypotheses are entertained, these arguments are examined, that they are hostile even about the discussion. And I'm just interested to know how much you come up against that in your general field. And if you do, I'd simply say all encouragement to press on despite that hostility. So it's a combination of question and encouragement for what that's worth.
Yeah, thanks. I guess I'm still testing the waters with what you're kind of allowed to say politically on these topics, because they are very touchy. And some evolutionary biologists are rabid anti-theists. That they really are. Some are, and I think it's higher in evolutionary biology than some other areas. But that's a very small proportion. So I've just decided not to be too worried about those people, because I don't think they have as much power as they like to have. And the main power they have is that people are kind of scared of them and don't say anything. But they're not really running the show for the most part, and they're just a bit louder than some others because politically they're allowed to be. But that's declining. So the Dawkins era is over, well over, and people are kind of open. But I'm just testing the waters because I don't want to be anti-evolutionary, and that's the main problem that Christians have had, is that design has been conflated with the rejection of evolution. And that's why I'm just really impressed with what Asa Gray. So that forces it to, like, either you go anti-evolutionary and go design, or you go pro-evolutionary, then you're anti-design. And then I think you've undercut a lot of good natural theology. And you've kind of shut the door on stuff that would be really helpful for promoting the Christian message and presenting the reasonableness of theism. And so I think there is a middle path, and Asa Gray had it back in 1860.
Well, I agree with you, and I think it's terribly important that you show your scientific expertise at every point, including your appreciation of all the hard scientific stuff that's supporting best evolutionary models now, stuff that I don't understand properly, but you do, and you need to be seen in your field as thoroughly scientifically expert. Then you have, quite rightly, the credentials to be able to speak further. But I as I say, I'm just intrigued that even those who aren't rabidly anti-theistic seem sometimes to be operating with a view of science, that this is the sort of discussion that just ought not to happen within scientific conversation, as if there's some limit to a proper scientific discussion, where the right answer is, hang on, we're asking reasonable questions and we're following where reasonable questions take us.
Yeah, well, I guess I'm actually okay with that. So I'm okay with saying, with putting a dotted line and saying this side is the philosophical interpretation. At least for my career, that's safer, basically. Just to say, okay, on this, when I'm on my free time, I'm doing this philosophical stuff. You guys don't need to worry about it, because I'm not saying I'm not saying I'm refuting current science or something. So that's
I agree with that too. I mean, you can draw that distinction between the scientific question and the philosophical question, but the one very naturally leads to the other. And the one is going to depend upon all sorts of philosophical presuppositions as well. So it's very simplistic to think you've got an easy, divide between the two fields.
And I think the way discussions and fine-tuning are happening is again just a great model. And that there are high-profile conferences on fine-tuning. There's physicists who'll talk about it. And if we get to something like that in biology, I'll be very happy. And that would be my life work will be done. If biologists are happy to have those discussions, even if it's not in science conferences, if they're just aware of that these discussions are happening, that would be a huge shift, I think.
Yeah, terrific. Well, all strength to your arm.
I know the Australians are dying to get to their dinner, but Philip Pattermore has just one last question for you, Zachary.
Thanks, Zachary. Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. You got very close to intelligent design at some points in your argument. I just wondered how you distinguish your argument from intelligent design. And I think you you did so just in the last answer to questions when you said you tolerated radical contingency in your argument.
Well, for me, the main distinction with intelligent design is they are defining themselves as anti-Darwinian.
Mm-hmm.
They see it as a dichotomy, either Darwin or design.
Yeah.
And they think that they haven't, I would say they haven't grappled with the arguments of people like Elliot Sober, Alvin Plantinga, Rene van Wildenberg, that you can have both, that the randomness, even the randomness of strict Darwinism is not incompatible with God's providence, and it's not even incompatible. The more controversial claim is it's not incompatible with an inference to design, but I think it's not. And some of the intelligent design work actually implicitly supports this. They have some work on genetic algorithms and such, which I think is relevant, that in certain cases, genetic algorithms need to be, there's more work to do on that, but I think there's a general case that if you want highly specified outcomes, you need a highly targeted algorithm. But they have some work on that, and then they kind of pull away from it because they are anti-Darwinian. That's their driving definition.
Yes.
So that's where someone like Michael Denton actually doesn't fit in very comfortably with them. But he's kind of tolerated because he's a scientist and because he has some interesting design arguments. They're actually a messy group, but at the core, they're anti-Darwinian.
Yeah.
I think.
No, I think that's right. And they emanated from a political wing of creationism.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of sympathetic to them. I mean, I don't know. Like Michael Denton was a big influence. He was working in New Zealand in Otago, and I think if they'd followed his route more, then things would have gone better for them. But they did get kind of taken over by American political.
I think sometimes they stop at an explanation as seeing, as you say, only two possibilities, and they stop the discussion, stop the curiosity, stop the investigation into further possible ideas of natural causation.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody. I think we should stop there and let Zach get on with his day. So thank you so much, Zach, for all these questions and all the answers that you've given, and
Thanks.
all the thought that you've put into this.
Yeah, it's nice to hear some New Zealand and Australian accents. So
yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. And thank you all of you for all your questions and for staying on. And we hope to see you all again soon.